In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the canvas preparation that's needed for when you're using oil over the top of watercolour. Hi, I'm Marion Dutton. I'm an artist and a teacher, and I love to paint in oil, acrylic and watercolour, a real mixed bag of goodies. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you and you like a little variety in your life, then do consider subscribing to the channel. So I'm going to keep this video short and sweet and get straight to the point and show you how I prepare my canvas boards to accept watercolour and then oil on top. So in my last video, I talked about using watercolour underneath oils to create some of these wonderful loose abstract backgrounds. For example, here with this swan, I've actually done all of the background in watercolour using some salt and some different techniques, and then I've switched to oils to create all the feathers in the swan. So how do I prepare the boards to use this technique? So some of the boards can already come pre-prepared for this particular technique. For example, the aqua board, and you're able to prepare this for watercolour and also for oils as well. I actually got in touch with the people at Aqua Board and asked them if it was safe. I knew that, of course, with it being aqua board, you could use watercolour, but was it also safe for the oils? And they confirmed that it actually is. So using this technique for on top of something like the aqua board is absolutely brilliant. And I will say it is an absolute joy to paint on, but they are expensive. So whilst this may be wonderful for something like a commission work where you're wanting to use your best materials, if you like, then the aqua board is highly recommended. I absolutely love painting on them for doing loose backgrounds and then followed by either a pet portrait or a portrait. For example, this is one I've done here, and again this is on the aqua board, and it really is an absolute pleasure to paint on these. But like I've said, the negative to these is they are quite expensive, and in particular if you want to begin practicing, then you know, these are quite an expensive way to practice. So there is an alternative, and that's just using a simple cheap canvas board. Now you can paint directly on top of these canvas boards with the watercolour and then of course let that dry and switch to oils, but you may find that the watercolour sits on the surface because this board isn't primed for watercolour, it's primed for acrylic or for oils. So again, this is just a real cheap, it's actually unbranded and it's a real cheap board, but I've done quite a few paintings on boards like this and they've worked a treat. And initially I have done them where I haven't primed the canvas and been quite pleased with the results. For example, here I didn't bother priming the board, I just went straight in with some watercolour, but I do find that the watercolour sits on the surface, whereas when you've actually primed the board, you can see it really does behave more like a watercolour and sort of absorbs into that board underneath. And again, this is another example of one that I didn't prepare, and I'm not sure if this is really being picked up on the camera, but the difference is when you don't prepare the boards, the paint sits on the surface. And again, unlike this one where it's absorbed and it's behaved a little bit more like it would do on watercolour paper. So what do we do to prepare our board? Well, you can actually buy Watercolor Grounds. This one is by Daniel Smith, is a watercolor ground, and you simply would cover this in 3 layers. There's some instructions on the back on how you need to do that. Unfortunately, they do only come in little tubs, so if you wanted to batch prepare a load of canvases, which is what I tend to do, then this is, you know, it's a bit small. The exciting thing about the Daniel Smith watercolor ground is they do a transparent watercolor ground, which would be absolutely ideal if you wanted to paint on something like this, which is a natural linen surface. And of course, if you were to put the transparent watercolor ground on this, that linen would show through and you'd be able to get some beautiful washes. So that is something I'm quite excited to have a little play with at some point down the line. I don't actually have any of the transparent, I only have the white. So of course, until I get some of that, I won't be able to play, but I am excited to try that out. So again, that might give you a few little ideas on the way you can use this. But let's talk about preparing the canvas. Now again, like I said, you can buy the Daniel Smith's watercolor ground, or you can make your own, which is a much cheaper option, and that's the route that I've gone down. So how do you make your own watercolor ground? Well, basically you need 1 part modeling paste and 3 parts white gesso. But again, credit where credit's due. This isn't my recipe. This is a recipe I've actually found from Liz Chadderton, both following her YouTube channel, and I will put a link to her channel in the description box below. If you haven't seen her videos, you really ought to check them out. She's super informative about anything to do with watercolour. So again, I do want to give Liz credit because she does cover the recipe in here and covers quite a lot about different canvas grounds and things like that. It really is an excellent book. Now, of course, Liz is into watercolour, whereas I want to be able to use this technique for watercolour and for oils. So I've followed the recipe and experimented, and it works an absolute treat for using as a ground for oil over watercolour. So again, this is 1 part modelling paste and 3 parts white gesso. So we have our modelling paste and our white gesso. Now I'm going to use small parts because again, I've already mixed quite a large batch here, and also I'm quite low on the modelling paste. So I'm just going to use 1 part modelling paste, normally my parts are much bigger. I usually do it the way Liz does it and use quite large parts, but for the demonstration this will be enough. And then of course it's 3 parts of the white gesso. 1, 2, 3. Put all that away, out of my way, and then you want to give that a good stirring. Really make sure you've got a really nice mixture in there. And that modelling paste allows the watercolour to behave more absorbently, to have that effect that it would have if you were using watercolour paper. Now bear in mind, it doesn't act exactly like watercolour paper, but it does give you a similar effect. So give that a good stir. And then I'll show you how I like to apply this. Now Liz likes to use a roller. I prefer to use a sponge. I feel like I get a smoother surface by using a sponge. And also, whilst you can sand these down between layers, I'm pretty lazy and I don't bother. So I like to give it a quick spritz, and this just helps the ground flow a little better. And then I'm going to go into my watercolour ground, And I would do the same if I was using the Daniel Smith's Watercolor Ground. Get some of that on the sponge, start in the middle, and then I just work my way up and down. You want thin layers, you don't want this to go on very, very thick. And you're going to apply 3 thin layers, but you do need to let them dry in between. Now again, like I said, you can sand this at the end if you want to, and there's 1 or 2 little lumps in here that I may sand out at the end. Now I usually do these in batches. I'll do quite a few canvases all at once, and then I'll leave them to dry for an hour, come back and apply a second layer. And then after your second layer, you do need to let it dry at least overnight. But even that, I've found you can actually lift the ground with the watercolor later. So I've left it for a good week before painting on these. I've actually dried it with the hairdryer just to speed things up a little bit, but normally I'd leave it about an hour. Like I say, I would have a batch of these and leave them for about an hour, and then they'll be dry enough. And again, I'm just going to repeat that process and add another layer of this watercolor ground. Put it on nice and thin. That spray just helps the ground move just a little easier. And then a nice light pressure going the other way. And as I've said already, I would do exactly the same with the Daniel Smith's Watercolor Ground. If you decided you didn't want to make your own and you wanted it ready-made, then you would apply it in exactly the same way. So again, that's the second layer. Again, I would leave this a good hour to dry. So again, after that second layer, I would let that dry another hour or so, and then put a third and final layer on that, nice and thinly, and then leave it to dry. And following the advice that I've read, ideally it does take acrylic grounds or acrylic to properly dry. It will take 2 to 3 days. So my advice when you're painting on these watercolor grounds is to leave it at least a week, or at least the minimum of 2 to 3 days. But I actually leave mine for a week before I even worry about starting to add any watercolor or oil on top of those. So here are a couple of examples where I've used a watercolor ground, or in this particular case I've actually used aqua board. So again, I've used these lovely loose washes and then switched to oils for some of the details. This will be available on the Mazart Academy, and I will put a link to that in the description box below. And again, here's another painting using, this is a homemade watercolor ground, and I'll cover the labelling in a moment, but this is a homemade watercolor ground exactly as I've just demonstrated. You can see we've got some lovely, it really does act very similar to watercolor when you you have this ground on there. And then I've switched over to oils using the wet on wet oil painting technique to create these lovely petals. And again, this is a tutorial that is coming up on the Mazart Academy. And finally, another painting here where I've used these gorgeous transparent washes. And again, this is a homemade watercolor ground. So again, you can see I've got these gorgeous transparent washes, and then I've switched to oils to do my normal underpainting technique that I typically use for portraits or for pet portraits. I like to be able to get quite a lot of detail in the underpainting. And I use an erase technique, which again, I've covered on this channel, so do be sure to check those out. So while I've got this here, I'm going to just discuss the labelling. And again, this is a tip from Liz about labelling up your boards once you've actually completed them. And this is so that if you're like me and you are batch painting quite a lot of these, or batch preparing a lot of canvas boards, you want to know what you've actually prepared them with. So with this one, I've got HM, which for me stands for Homemade Watercolor Ground, and there's 3 coats of that on. Now, if I was using the Daniel Smiths, I'd just put DS Watercolor Ground ×3. So that labelling is quite important, and you can see I've done that with all of these here, where I've batch painted these, or batch prepared them, and then I've marked them up on the back so I know exactly what preparation these canvas boards have had. I really do hope you find this video tutorial helpful and that it's give you a little bit more of an understanding of the oil over watercolour technique. Once you've prepared those boards and you've let them thoroughly dry, then you are free to practice and play and experiment. And I really do hope you have a lot of fun doing so. I certainly have enjoyed myself over the last couple of weeks whilst I've been experimenting and playing around with this technique. I have created some full-length tutorials which will be available on the Mazart Academy as soon as I've got round to doing those edits, but hopefully they'll be on at the end of this, or by the end of this month. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.